Okay, I wanted to welcome everybody to our first webinar of 2015. This is a recorded portion of the presentation by Alan Hess on Googie architecture. If you're interested in learning more about Tiki and brutalism, we have a paired recording with this that will also be offered alongside this recording. I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Alan Hess is an architect and historian. He's an has been an architecture critic for the San Jose Mercury News. He's written 19 books on modern architecture, and his latest book, Frank Lloyd Wright, Natural Design Organic Architecture, was published in October 2012. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. Alan Hess, and please feel free to begin.
Good. Thank you, John, and I'm very glad to be able to do this for the CPF. Googie architecture is, to me, really central to an understanding of modern architecture in the world and in the U.S. and especially in California, where it really started. I'll get into the whole history of what the term Googie means and where it came from and so forth. But right here at the beginning, let me just say that Googie architecture has not been considered true architecture, let alone true modernism, for a long time, since the 1940s, actually, when the term was first invented to describe this style of architecture that we're going to be talking about. And yet I have found, and what attracted me to this whole subject originally when I started in the 1980s to research it, what attracted me to this subject is that despite very learned people saying that this was not architecture, I saw architecture. It was three-dimensional. It had concepts to it. It was definitely modern. It was dealing with modern materials, modern spaces, modern ideas, and even theory, as we're going to be seeing a little bit later. It was architecture. Why wasn't it considered to be serious architecture by many people? We'll be getting into that. But in a nutshell, because it was both popular and it was commercial. And in the establishment academic architecture community, architecture which was commercial was in some way, they thought, tainted. It could not be truly serious architecture. And if it was popular, if it was for the average person, it also had kind of a negative connotation to it. Real modern architecture was architecture usually either large office buildings like Lever House by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill in New York, or it was beautiful custom homes. For example, the Edgar Kaufman House by Richard Neutra in Palm Springs, a real icon of modern architecture. Those are definitely great architecture, but they're not all that modern architecture is about. Googie, I contend, is a major part of modern architecture in the 20th century, especially the mid-20th century, because it really more successfully than any other type of architecture, made modern architecture available to the average person in their daily lives. It didn't require, a wealthy person to be able to hire an architect to do a custom home. It was there and it was meant for everybody. Well, okay, let's get on with the slideshow. These have nothing to do with Googie architecture. They're 1949 Fords. I throw them in just because it's one of my favorite slides and because of the colors. Notice the colors of these cars. This is 1949. And unlike today where you get silver, and then you get black cars, and then you get white cars, and then you get more silver cars, and then more black cars, and more white cars. in this period of time that we're going to be talking about, where Googie architecture is really being born and spreading, we have color, we have form, we have shape, as we shall see. Googie architecture is about Tomorrowland. This is Tomorrowland at Disneyland, which opened in 1955. And these are good examples of Googie architecture there at Disneyland. But it is about not just a futuristic sense of Tomorrowland, but about Todayland. Tomorrow, the future, had arrived after World War II. And Googie architecture captured that. It really kept it, it made it real and on the landscape, again, where anybody could enjoy it. So that's a major part of what Googie architecture is. Googie architecture is also about suburbia, very much. And this course, because it is connected with suburbia, this is another aspect which establishment academics used to denigrate Googie architecture. Suburban architecture was not as important, they thought, as standard center city urban architecture. And yet, suburban architecture, the whole trend towards suburbia, was the major urban effort and accomplishment in this mid-century period in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The old center cities at that time were decaying, they were congested, they were polluted, they were old. And so the progressive idea, and again, among many actually very well-known critics, theorists like Lewis Mumford, for example, the idea of correcting the problems of the center city by reinventing the urban area as suburban with more space, with more flexibility, with new architecture, with greenery. So the idea of suburbia was actually a very progressive idea in the 1940s and the 1950s. Now, the range of architecture in suburbia was very great. Some of it was very good. Some of it was very bad. Here we have some examples of shopping centers, of housing tracts, of signage, of gas stations. And you get a sense of how, at this time, architects, developers, planners were inventing a new type of city, the suburban metropolis, outside the center city. Low-rise, multi-centered, and yet with all of the needs and all of the sorts of things that you needed in a city. Shopping, schools, gas stations, housing, all of these things were being fitted in, but exactly how, nobody exactly knew. So there was a lot of experiment going on at this time to figure out how to design suburbia. Of course, the major defining technology of suburbia was the automobile. It was a part of technology. Modernism is about the application of modern technology to architecture. The automobile is modern technology and became a major shaper of Googie architecture as well as suburbia. Now, this didn't all just happen after World War II. There is, especially in Southern California, elsewhere in the country too, a trend towards figuring out how to use the automobile in designing new cities that solve the problems of the old cities. One example, starting in the late 1920s, is the Miracle Mile in Los Angeles. This is Wilshire Boulevard that you see here, Wilshire right near Western. On the left there is the Wiltern Theater, which is still standing. It's a beautiful, it's in color, you'd see that it is a turquoise terracotta. But notice, looking down Wilshire Boulevard, which was a new street at that time, notice the towers that mark the way. What you have here is a new type of city, what Rainer Banham later called a linear downtown, where you have all of the elements of a downtown. You have office buildings, you have shopping, you have theaters, and you have residences, but they're laid out in a linear fashion. You see the towers, the office towers, you see the commercial buildings on either side. And just beyond these commercial buildings, you would see residential areas, beautiful large custom homes, garden apartments, standard apartments, single-family homes, so that in fact a person could live in Hancock Park or any of the other neighborhoods along the Miracle Mile and walk to shopping, theater, etc. In fact, of course, the Miracle Mile is still a part of Los Angeles. And in fact, it is one of the densest urban areas in any American city. Now, this is counter to perhaps what people would assume. They think of Los Angeles as the least dense city in the country. But in fact, this new idea of how to design for the automobile, known as the Miracle Mile, was a very effective way to organize the city and create density which was needed, practical density. So you have this again from the late 1920s into the 1930s, this example in Southern California of a new approach to designing for the automobile. Along Wilshire at this time, the architects of Los Angeles invented new types of architecture, and they were designed for the automobile. This is a Ralph's supermarket in Beverly Hills, designed by Morgan Walls and Clements, one of the great inventive architects of Los Angeles, in the streamlined modern style. This is from the 1930s. Or the May Company, 1940, by A.C. Martin, another great Los Angeles firm, also on the Miracle Mile, and in its form, with this great corner of a gold ceramic tile, almost like a giant perfume bottle. You see how the building is responding to the automobile. There's no question of where the May Company was. You could see it coming, blocks away. This building, fortunately, also is still standing. Now notice, if you will, over on the left-hand side there's a sign for Simon's Sandwiches. We're going to be seeing that building in a few more slides because it was right next door to it. Now, Southern California, actually the whole nation, also in the automobile era, developed an approach to architecture which is called programmatic architecture. I like to call it giant object architecture. And the idea was to combine advertising with architecture to create new forms. And the idea was, if you sold ice cream, then you made your building look like a giant milk can. Or if you were selling hot dogs, as we shall see, you would make your building look like a giant hot dog. Now, why was this? This was using modern advertising and the scale required for an automotive building, a building which could be seen instantly and understood instantly from the automobile. And so you have a number of these buildings, not just in Southern California, but all across the country, of programmatic buildings. This one was in the Los Angeles area, and I include it especially here because in the early 1930s, the great industrial designer Norman Bell Geddes wrote a book called Horizons, and he uses this example on the left-hand side there of this ice cream can as an example. In the early 1930s, he was saying, look, this is a new type of architecture. It's a response to the automobile. And it has the vitality of the modern era. It's like vaudeville. It's like jazz. It's like the movies. And it's something entirely new. And Southern California, though not the sole source of these buildings, certainly developed these types of buildings, as we shall see, to a remarkable degree. Here are a couple more examples. Randy's Donuts, which still stands, thank goodness. The Tail of the Pup, which is in storage today. We keep hearing stories about it being brought out and used as a hot dog stand again. We can keep our fingers crossed that at some point that will happen. These buildings were from the 1920s, 1930s. Randy's Donuts actually was from the 1950s. All response, usually just by a business owner saying, or a contractor saying, well, let's make it look like a giant hot dog. Milton Black, incidentally, was the architect of the Tail of the Pup. He was a very successful, streamlined, modern architect, mostly did apartments. But there were other architects working in Southern California who said, this is a new type of city. How can we design for the automobile? And a very important early example is this Yucca Vine Market by Lloyd Wright, a Los Angeles architect, the son of Frank Lloyd Wright, from 1928. And this is just a remarkably prescient building. You see in this, of course, it's a market with a number of different stores in it. The walls are open so that you can get into the store easily. The parking is right in the front, again, very convenient. But notice also that pylon on the left-hand side. That has the same purpose as the giant donut or the giant hot dog. The point was to grab the attention of people driving along at 30 or 40 miles an hour on the street so that they would pull into this. And of course it is in a modern style, not an international style, not a streamlined modern style, an organic modern style, which Lloyd Wright and his father and many other architects followed, another aspect of modern architecture. Extremely important building, no longer standing. Now it's interesting to compare with what was going on elsewhere in the country. This is a White Tower diner from New Jersey in the mid-1930s. It's modern, streamlined modern, with rounded windows, but notice that it has a front door. This is, well, let's go on, because this is what was being built in Southern California at exactly the same time. Simon's Drive-In, this is the Simon's. I pointed out the sign earlier right across from the May Company. This is the building that was on that site. And if you look down, you see there's no front door. This building is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The climate, of course, here allows for that, but also the freedom of driving in and getting out of your car, going in, sitting at the counter, or being served in your car. I'm starting with this nighttime shot, because notice how they use neon. Also a new technological material at the time. And it is used to create a pylon, which is visible by day or by night very effectively, as you can see, as well as the other neon trimming the building. This was designed by Wayne McAllister, one of the great unsung modern architects. I consider this building, let's go on to some other photographs of it. Here we have some other photos showing it in the daytime, showing the openness of it without a front door, with the car hops. It was circular in design so that the car hops could get from the kitchen to the cars very easily, and also so that the cars could park all the way around most conveniently and efficiently near the kitchen so that the people could be served. This is, in my estimation, the most modern building of the 1930s built anywhere in the world, because it is responding not only to modern materials, not only to modern technology like the car, but to modern lifestyles. And it is completely reconfiguring the building for the automobile and for the customer and for the workers, the car hops. Just a brilliant original design, entirely modern in its conception. This is another drive-in, also by Wayne McAllister. It actually was a small drive-in by Plummer and File, and then Wayne McAllister, about 1938 or 39, expanded it. It's a Van de Kamp's restaurant, bakery, and drive-in restaurant, as I said, by Wayne McAllister as well. This is an interesting building because we have these new buildings designed for the automobile that were popping up all over Los Angeles. And nobody knew quite what to make of it. One of the people who didn't know quite what to make of it was the very distinguished critic and historian Henry Russell Hitchcock, who in 1940 visited Los Angeles. And he wrote about it in Arts and Architecture magazine. And he identified this particular building and said, this type of building is an example of the most modern architecture being developed in California at that time. But he also went on to say that it was anonymous. Now, the fact is it was not anonymous. It was designed by Wayne McAllister. McAllister was working as an architect in Los Angeles. Henry Russell Hitchcock could have called up Wayne McAllister on the phone and talked to him about this building. He didn't. Why? Because the old critical establishment just thought this stuff appeared. They thought it was vernacular, like a log cabin. They didn't even think that it was actually designed. It was so far out of their conception of what modern architecture was. And yet Hitchcock recognized exactly how astonishing and creative the architecture was. Well, after World War II, the Depression was over. People wanted to get back to normal lives. There was a tremendous pressure for housing. And as I've said before, suburbia was the answer to that housing and urban crisis of that period. One of the people who posited a solution for what this new city should look like was Frank Lloyd Wright. This is a drawing of Broadacre City. His proposal for what these modern decentralized cities should look like. The realities included some of his ideas of decentralization, but as the new freeways were built, this is the Hollywood Freeway and the Cahuenga Pass. Notice that there was still a red car going down the center of it, later removed, of course, by the early 1950s. The freeways were changing the look of the city. There were all sorts of new technologies. For example, the jet engine, which had been developed first during World War II and then perfected. And by the mid-1950s, it had achieved its commercial aspects. The average person could buy a ticket if they could afford it. It was very expensive then. But they could buy a ticket on a jet airplane to go from Los Angeles to New York in just a few hours. A trip which had taken days on the railroad just a few years before. This was a symbol of the changes in American life. Space travel was another example. It wasn't until the late 1950s that we actually sent up Sputniks, satellites, and then got going on the moon. But it was the idea of space travel was part of the culture already, even before it actually happened. Not only in children's books, as you see on the left there, but in the 1959 Cadillac tail fin. That is a rocket ship tail, and the red tail lights are fire spitting out of the rocket, a symbol of the enthusiasm, the excitement in the most prestigious car of the times for this new era of how things had so radically changed. Of course, one of the most radical changes was atomic energy. Atomic energy had helped to win World War II, American technology to invent the atomic bomb. had accomplished that. And so by the early 1950s, we still had above ground atomic testing out in Nevada. And it was broadcast live to the breakfast tables of Americans on television. Television, another new technology that was changing people's lives. So this gives you an idea in the 1940s and 1950s just how radically life was changing, and people were aware of this. And the architecture of the roadside was responding to that, changing with that. And this is where we get Googie architecture, using space-age motifs, ultra-modern forms, and of course, designed for the automobile and the automotive way of life. This is Tiny Nailers, 1949, by Douglas Honnold, at the corner of Sunset and La Brea, one of the great examples torn down in the 1980s, replaced with something hideously inappropriate. Ships, Westwood, by Martin Stern Jr. This opened in 1958. Again, right on Wilshire at Glendon, one of the great Googie coffee shops. What we have here is some of the elements of Googie. It is a restaurant in a garden surrounded by glass so that you could look out to the street. And it had pylons of stone, in this case artificial stone, growing up out of this garden, and then hovering over it to shelter this building were these hovering high-tech cantilevered roofs. You see that the boomerang shape on the right-hand side of the roof line, and of course over it all a neon sign which echoed the forms, was an integral part of the architecture, so that the building could be identified by day or by night. Now, where did the term Googie come from? This is the original restaurant called Googie's, built in 1949 by John Lautner at the corner of Crescent Heights and Sunset, right on Sunset Strip. John Lautner, of course, one of Frank Lloyd Wright's apprentices, moved to Los Angeles in the 1930s, designed a couple of drive-in restaurants, and also then in 1949 designed this building. This building in 1952, the great photographer Julius Shulman was driving the editor Douglas Haskell, editor at the time of House and Home magazine, around Los Angeles to show him what was going on, what was new. Haskell drove by this and he said, "What in the world is this?" And Shulman said, "Oh, that's Googie architecture. This ultra-modern architecture, new forms, new shapes, but designed for the automobile, with this roof which grabbed your attention." The roof became a sign, basically, with the glass so that you could sit inside and look at the Hollywood Hills just off to the left here. And without any sense of traditional form, this isn't classical, this isn't Gothic, this is an entirely new set of forms in architecture. Haskell wrote an article in his magazine, House and Home, called Googie Architecture, and that article gave the term Googie its name, which would be spread all across the country, because buildings like this were being built all across the nation. And nobody knew quite what to make of them. A lot of people were very unhappy with it because it looked undisciplined, it looked cheap, it looked too unusual. It looked like a parody of modernism to some, which gave the term Googie the negative connotation among many that it had, unfortunately, for many decades. Many examples of Googie architecture. In the upper left-hand corner is one of the original McDonald's. This is the one still standing. It's a landmark, a national historic landmark in Downey. It was built in 1953 by Stanley Meston, architect, with the McDonald brothers. To the right is Ben Frank's on the Sunset Strip. This is still standing also, though it is it's another restaurant, Mills. It's a Mills restaurant now. Lower left-hand corner is the Witch Den by Armain Davis. Armain Davis became the primary architects of Googie coffee shops. And this was one excellent example in combining both the car hop service on the left with the sit-down restaurant on the right. The pylon, as you can see, is a signboard. It's also completely integrated into the design and the shapes and the diagonals of the forms of this building. And the lower right is a Biff's restaurant by Douglas Haskell, the same architect of Tiny Nailers I showed you just a little bit before. This was a smaller diner, however. And notice how intimate it is with the automobile. The automobiles of the customers are parked right outside the window, kind of like your horse that you tied up outside of the saloon and when you went in. There was no concern about separating the customer from the automobile. The whole automobile landscape, from the dashboard to the counter, was a unified designed area. This is a major part of Googie architecture in this period. More examples: upper left-hand corner, a car dealership. Bottom left-hand corner, another car dealership. Upper right is a car wash. And you see in the shapes, the forms, the use of engineered forms, cantilevers, web expanded I-beams, arches. You see modern engineering, modern architecture being used in these buildings. And then in the lower right-hand corner, a public building, the Athene building at LAX airport. Or at the Seattle World's Fair in 1962, the Space Needle is a great public architecture in the Googie style. So the Googie style is primarily for roadside commercial architecture for the average for daily life, but it was also flexible enough to be used for public buildings as well in this period. Another example, excuse me, is the TWA terminal at New York's JFK Airport by Eero Saarinen, a very distinguished architect. But you can obviously see that the forms, the shapes are right parallel to those of Googie architecture. This is why Googie architecture is serious architecture. Or also by Eero Saarinen, this is the GM Tech Center, opened in 1956, where you see a brand new Cadillac sitting in one of the lobbies with this extraordinary suspended staircase going up to the second floor. This is a bowling alley, which often was Googie architecture. Now, this is a 3D slide. And depending upon where you're sitting, if you can cross your eyes and overlap these two images, I'll give you a moment to try that out. You'll see this Crenshaw bowl by Armain Davis in 3 dimensions. So cross your eyes and see if that'll work for you. It gives you an idea of the spatial depth of these buildings. Hope you got to see that. It's a great thing. Jack Laxer took that photograph. Here again we have the Witch Stand. Now, where did Googie come from? Well, I mentioned John Lautner designed the original restaurant called Googie's, and it does trace Googie back to the organic architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. Here we have Romeo's Times Square, now Johnny's at the corner of La Brea, not La Brea, Fairfax and Wilshire. This is a city landmark in the city of Los Angeles. Notice the similarities to Taliesin West. Again, the concept of it is of, as at Taliesin, concrete walls growing up out of the ground, this earthy, organic sense of architecture. And then on top of that, you have, hovering ever so lightly, this high-tech cantilevered roof. That's the concept. Ancient earthen architecture and high-tech modern engineering. And that is a theme of Googie architecture that you will see. Inside, the spaces also were modern, not boxes with four walls, but rather flowing space, no edge to them, flowing around corners. Here, this one of the Huddle restaurants, you see how the balcony on the left is kind of hovering. You see the soffit on the right also hovering. There are no corners to this. This is a free-flowing open space, again, following the ideas of Frank Lloyd Wright. The man in the white coat there is Eldon Davis of Armand Davis. I like to throw in the photos of him so that you can see that he was an actual person at a book signing that we did a number of years ago, sponsored by the LA Conservancy. Another interior, this was Chips Westwood, which no longer stands. Shows you the colors, shows you the textures, shows you the patterns. This wasn't just a plain white modern box that we often think of as modern architecture. This is colorful. This drew you in. And notice again, no corners. The space is flowing around the edges so that you have the sense of everlasting space. And on the right, you get a glimpse looking out to the street. Norm's Restaurant on La Cienega. This building, fortunately, is still standing, and it was designated a Los Angeles City landmark earlier this year, 2015. In the back of the building, again, you see the different textures and patterns. You see the sloped roof. You see the lights, the can lights. You see the terracotta, the terrazzo floor. You see the chairs. Those are Eames chairs that are being used for it. You see stone there on the left. You see an artwork out of plastic, a new material there on the right as a dividing element. All of these elements common to modern Googie architecture. There are other aspects of Googie architecture as well. This was one of the early prototypes for Jack in the Box. It was designed by Smith and Williams, very well known, very well respected Pasadena architects, known for their houses, known for their planning projects, but they also designed Jack in the Boxes and other roadside restaurants. The great architects, John Lautner, Quincy Jones, Smith and Williams, of this period, known for their work, also considered the average roadside architecture to be a legitimate project for their for their creative talents. We don't get that sort of attention today from our well-known architects, unfortunately. In contrast, this is a drive-in restaurant by Mies van der Rohe, which was designed for Indianapolis, never built. Frankly, Mies is a great architect, but he did not know how to design a roadside drive-in. Armand Davis, Wayne McAllister, Smith and Williams, Martin Stern, these architects that we don't know as well, but we should, are the ones who really knew how to design these sorts of modern buildings. But notice that these buildings are for the average person. This is an important part about Googie architecture. As I said earlier, you didn't have to hire an expensive architect to design a custom home, to live the modern life. You can live the modern life for the price of a hamburger or a piece of pie at any of these coffee shops. And to bolster my contention that this is real architecture, on the left there we have a piece of design by one of the constructivist architects of early Soviet Russia from the 1920s. It is a tribunal. It's a place for communicating to the masses. The letters there at the very top spell out Lenin, so it's a monument to Lenin. But notice the similarities between this constructivist design from the early 1920s and the design of Pan's sign from the mid-1950s by Armand Davis. The diagonals, the sense of energy, the sense of movement forward, the sense of looking towards the future. Both of these types of architecture reflect that. Now, there's no direct connection. The Googie architects were not inspired or influenced by the constructivists. But designing for the modern era, for communication, for the population, for the average person, they arrived at extraordinarily similar forms. We need Googie architecture. There's Pan's on the right, and on the left is, across the street, a much more typical sign from the past decade or two. Googie architecture, there was a great, as I said, it was not considered architecture. There was a reaction against it among some parts of the architecture community. It resulted in extreme sign ordinances that did away with neon, that did away with animated signs, that did away with beautifully formally designed signs like Pan's. And in return, we got these very dull square signs, which are now so common. This is why we need to remember our heritage of Googie architecture and hopefully bring some of it back. Bob's Big Boy from 1949, also a landmark, an LA County landmark, designed also by Wayne McAllister, who had started in the 1930s with the drive-ins and then did these larger coffee shops. Again, this is from 1949. But notice how it works in the city. The signboard with a great circle on the Bob's, and then look to the right, down the road to that Lucky's Market, also a large signboard, also the circle. In the broad spaces of the suburban metropolis, Googie architecture was not only great architecture, it was a great urban architecture, urban design in tying together these vast spaces of suburbia through design. And in the design of individual buildings, we have in Googie architecture a remarkably integrated piece of design. This is not two-dimensional architecture. This is not stage-set architecture, which it often was accused of being. Here we see Pan's as you would approach it. Down the street, you see the roof. To attract your attention, you see the sign, you see the glass incorporated so that you can, as you drive by, you can look in and see the customers eating, dining within, helping you to maybe pull in yourself if you're hungry. You park your car, you get out and you walk up to the front door. You have the sign overhead, still the scale of the street, but notice on the right as you approach the doors, the handles of the doors, echoing the forms and shapes of the sign and of the building as well, all an integral part of architecture, integral design, artwork, architecture, space, all integrated. This is what good architecture does, whether it is a museum, or if it is a library, or if it is a house, or if it is a coffee shop. This sort of integrated design. We're going to be wrapping up here. And so I wanted to talk just a little bit about preservation. That's what many of us are interested in here. As I've gone through, I've mentioned a number of restaurants, the Googie restaurants, which have been made into landmarks and are preserved to one degree or another. It's still something we need to fight for. Many of these examples are still threatened to this day. The Biffs, there was a whole chain that you see at the bottom of this slide. None of them exist anymore, entirely gone. Extremely handsome buildings, part of the modern movement, completely vanished from the landscape. Above there is Norm's on La Cienega, which earlier this year, as I mentioned, became an LA City landmark. It is one of the great buildings of California and of modernism. When we think of modernism and the case study houses, the residential buildings, beautiful post and beam steel or wood houses surrounded by glass that capture the California lifestyle and the idea of modernism as pleasure in a residential design? Well, Norms does that also, but it's a democratic building. It is for everyone. Anybody can come to this building and participate in the modern era. It has all of the connection between indoors and outdoors that the case study houses and California modern design did. This Norms is in extraordinarily good condition, especially considering that it has been operating as a restaurant since 1957, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It is an extraordinary thing. It is as important to California architecture as the Kaufman House by Richard Neutra, as Case Study House number 22 by Pierre Koenig, the great house perched on top of the hill with all of Los Angeles spread at its feet. This is California architecture, especially because it is for the average person. It is democratic. It is commercial. Because of those reasons, we should not overlook it as being important. This building, even though it is a city landmark now, is still threatened. This is something that I would advise you to keep your eye open for in the next few months, especially, so that we can help to save it. It is just an incredibly important building. So, as we wrap up here, never close. We can only hope. This is actually on the second Googie's restaurant, which was on Pershing Square in downtown Los Angeles, also by Armand Davis. It was in the base of a multi-story hotel, which has since been replaced. It did close. It is no longer there. We need to protect this heritage of our California modern architecture, which Googie is a major part of. We need to defend and stand up for commercial architecture and democratic architecture, architecture for the average person, which Googie represents. I hope all of you will keep your eyes open for more examples of this and help to defend them whenever they can. So that's the end of my talk. Thanks for joining me this afternoon or evening or morning or whenever it is that you're watching this. And thanks for listening.
Thank you, Alan. I actually, as you spoke, I thought of a number of questions, and I thought since nobody else is in the room, that I'll be the one to ask the questions here, and I was hoping you have a few more minutes to answer some questions of mine.
Sure.
I actually wanted to discuss the connection between the space race a bit more and Googie architecture, and I noticed you sort of talked about the rocket theme in the rear end of the cars and things like that. But Googie often features designs that resemble the Sputnik satellite and different sort of aspects of the space race. And how much do you think there's a connection there? How much do you think it's just coincidental? And what do you think? What do you think that says about Googie architecture?
Yeah, the connections are not coincidental. Googie architecture, as I said, with the constructivist architecture of Russia, Googie architecture is a communications medium for the culture. It's one way that the culture has to express its ideas, its enthusiasms, what is on the common mind. And certainly in the 1950s, the space age, the space race, was on the mind of the average person. It was everywhere. It was in movies, it was in magazines, it was in architecture as well. And so, not in all, but in some Googie architecture, you will get certain motifs. For example, what's called the dingbat, the starburst as well. The exploding, looking like an exploding star. And that could be in a chandelier in one of the coffee shops, or it could be part of the sign outside, or the motif of the atom with the nucleus and the protons, going around the center. That's another motif, an ornamental motif that you will see. Or in ships in Westwood that I showed you, the rocket-shaped sign for that. Ships actually referred to Matthew Shipman, who was the creator of it, but the sign obviously also evokes the interest in the space race, rockets, and so forth of that period. Why? Because that's one more thing that might appeal to somebody to say, hey, that would be fun, let's go in there and buy a hamburger.
Okay, and maybe a bit of a follow-up question, and it's, speaking as more of a preservation professional, I'm going to put that hat on now and talk a little bit more about integrity. And when it comes to Googie architecture, it seems like the setting and the location is important. And maybe hypothetically, say a large boulevard that was oriented towards the car was turned into a pedestrian-friendly, sort of walkable boulevard. I mean, there's proposals in San Francisco to turn Market Street into a walking boulevard. And I'm wondering how you think that would impact the integrity of Googie architecture, whether you think the car is needed to make it Googie architecture, whether you see this style of architecture in sort of a walkable setting, and what do you think that means?
Yeah, good question. Because we need to keep these buildings around, and they do need to adapt to changing times. And so I would say that they are pedestrian-oriented. They're designed for pedestrians walking up to them. So they already have aspects of that. So if a Googie building happened to end up on a pedestrian mall of some sort, I think it could fit in very well. There are also, as I pointed out in one of those last slides, these urban design characteristics embedded in the idea of Googie architecture. The idea of scale, the idea of transparency, being able to see inside the building and what's going on. Certainly the idea of communication, of ideas of the times. All of these things are cues, in my estimation, that a good urban designer could use based upon Googie architecture to create an entire new neighborhood, a new district, if necessary. And so these are not going to be old-fashioned and outdated buildings. They have ideas in them which can be used by creative designers so that they can become part, that these historic buildings can become part of the future.
The system has detected that a minimum number of lines are connected to this conference. Do you want to continue your meeting? Press 1 to confirm. If there is no response, the conference will end.
Hi, Ellen. This is John. I'll just cut that out of the recording. Actually, that was the phone conference line cutting itself out.
Yeah, rejoin.
Okay, we're back. I think we're back on. Do you hear me?
Can you hear me now? I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I forgot that when I started this room, the phone conference line has a timeout feature on it if nobody else is dialed into it. But anyways, I'll cut that out of the recording so it won't be there. Anyways, I wanted to ask one final question before we go, and that was in relation to the use of Googie architecture. And you mentioned that it was primarily a commercial use, sometimes government and civic use. But I don't think you ever mentioned any residential examples. And that's one thing maybe that I've noticed about Googie is I can't personally think of an example that is a residential that one would call a Googie style, but maybe you can think of any examples like that, or if they even exist.
Yes, there are definitely residential examples that use many of the formal themes of Googie architecture, porte cocheres, carports that are integrated into the whole mass of the house, for example, or using butterfly roofs, cantilevered roofs like the one in Ship's Westwood, for example. The kind of soffit, upturned soffit that you see in tiny nailers, for example. That's another motif. So many of the, Googie architecture uses many of the motifs of modern architecture of those times. What I'm not sure I would necessarily call a residential building Googie, because Googie is usually a public building out in public rather than in a private residential area. But there are many overlaps. I think the major point is that modern architecture, mid-century modern architecture, has a wide variety of ideas and spectrums and forms in it. It isn't just the flat roof, steel-framed, glass-walled box. That's one type of modern architecture, but not the only. The architecture with these organic forms, as in Googie, are also just as much a part of modern architecture.
Thank you so much, Alan. And we will now conclude this session, and we'll make it available as a recording on our website. If you're interested in more programs from the California Preservation Foundation, please visit news.californiapreservation.org/events. And I really appreciate your time today, Alan, and look forward to working with you more.
Good. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.